Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Today, we're going to be talking about a new publication from our Mexico Institute. It's titled Mexico's Next President, Challenges and Recommendations. And we have a lot of Mexico Institute firepower to share with you today. Joining us is the director of the Center of the Institute, Andrew Rudman, and the deputy director, Lila Abed. Andrew and Lila, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
So let me start with that you co-authored the introduction, and the first sentence: Mexico's June 2nd, 2024 election will be the largest and most consequential in the country's history. Boom, quite a start. Why? What makes this so consequential?
Well, I'll start, and Lila will jump in, John. It is the most consequential for a number of reasons. First of all, it will be the largest, the most number of positions filled at any one time in any one Mexican election. It is also very likely to be the first time that Mexico elects a woman as president, something that we haven't done yet here in the United States. And the third reason I would say is just the reality of all the challenges that will face the next president and the next Congress in Mexico. Many of those are similar to the challenges that we will face here in the United States, things like climate change, economic development, addressing inequality. And when you combine all those things, I think you get a pretty consequential election.
Yeah, and just to add to what Andrew just mentioned, John, it's going to be extremely important who inherits, the Mexican presidency, as he or she, more likely as she, will not only become the first female president of Mexico, but we're really going to get an idea of how Congress is going to either promote the president's agenda, or whether we're going to have a majority of the opposition who's really going to act as a balancing power, right, to the executive branch. And so it's going to be a very consequential election, and that's sort of the reasoning why we put together this publication, months before the June 2nd elections. And it's really an effort on our behalf with our different authors discussing 6 main issues on what the next president should really do once she or he inherits power, right? And it's how do you propel prosperity, economic prosperity? How do you further integrate the North American region utilizing the USMCA? How do you handle issues like water management and water insecurity, both internally in Mexico, but with its border in the United States? Security issues, which is one of those issues that even though we focus more on just Mexico, it's hard to talk about security, right, without sort of involving U.S. security cooperation with its southern neighbor. And finally, nearshoring is this huge phenomenon, which is Andrew's chapter, so he can delve a little more into that. But it's this phenomenon, this unique opportunity for Mexico, the United States, and even Canada to really reap the benefits of a lot of the global trends that have arisen in the last years. And that's really the reasoning why we put this publication together in an effort to spark conversation. We are aware that not all the recommendations that are included in this book are going to be adopted by the next president, but it's definitely something that we hope they do. And we truly hope that we can spark conversations about important issues that are going to be detrimental or fundamental to Mexico's future.
I want to tell our viewers, this is what it looks like. A terrific looking publication and a great read. And if you come to wilsoncenter.org and come to the Mexico Institute on the programs tab, you'll be able to find this and download a copy and read it for yourself. Also, earlier today, before we recorded this episode of Now, Lila and Andrew were part of a larger, more in-depth discussion than we'll have here with some of the other authors. And so there's another resource for you. I also should mention, Lila, you referenced it maybe, or maybe I'm just anticipating that you would, that you have a microsite that explains the Mexican elections. And it is another terrific resource in addition to this book.
That's right. When Andrew and I were sort of thinking about the electoral cycle programming for the Mexico Institute in the upcoming months, one of our main objectives was to share really important information about Mexico's electoral process to more of a U.S. audience, right? So we have put together an elections microsite that you can now access on the Mexico Institute website. And we have not only election information, sort of the 101 on what's happening in Mexico in the next coming months. But we also have included expert analysis with, you know, the greatest analysts of Mexico on issues that are going to be really important for the next president. And we also will be providing updated polling data, you know, depending on how close we get to the June 2nd elections. But I'm sure Andrew can elaborate a little bit further as well.
Andrew, Lila told us about how the project came about and what the goals are. Could you talk to us about how you selected the topics and the authors?
Sure. You know, the first thing to say is we picked 6 topics we could. There are others that we could have picked. And one of the challenges that I think we often have in general in the Mexico Institute is the number of issues that could possibly be covered that impact a bilateral relationship really does exceed what we're capable of. We wanted in this case, most of the authors are affiliated with the Mexico Institute, with the exception of Ariel Ruiz with Migration Policy Institute, with which the Mexico Institute and the Wilson Center have a long established relationship. So the first thing was we wanted in-house, to highlight our in-house expertise and knowledge. The second, John, is we tried to come up with issues where collaboration with the United States would be advantageous, if not essential. So even though we aimed it at what the Mexican president might do or we thought should do, we wanted to focus on issues where there really is a pretty clear US-Mexico combination. And that led us to exclude issues that are also really important, but both for the interest of length of the book and recognizing kind of that we wanted to focus on things that were US-Mexico related. That's how we came up with the 6.
Well, certainly, I'm sorry. Lila had mentioned most of the topics, but I'll quickly review the table of contents for our viewers: energy, migration, USMCA and North America, security, water, and nearshoring. And Lila, I want to start with asking you about the chapter that you co-authored on security, because look, the unfortunate reality is the old, if it bleeds, it leads scenario. And so often, if anything goes wrong, if there's crime, if there are security issues, you know, that's what people are going to hear about. It's a big bite, something to talk about in a chapter when giving advice to an incoming president. How did you approach it? And give us some preview of some of the things that you and your co-author ended up writing about.
Yeah, I think you touched upon something that's essential, right, John? And it's that in the upcoming months, we're not just going to have elections in Mexico, but we're going to also have elections in the United States, right? They coincide every 12 years. And so a lot of the rhetoric that might be coming in terms of security and how it relates to Mexico might be more negative than positive, right? And so one of the efforts of the security chapter was to not necessarily include the quote unquote traditional security issues such as organized crime or money laundering, but we focused on a more nuanced analysis of certain issues that might not be as frequently discussed on the US-Mexico relationship, but they are very important internally to Mexico's future. And so we talk about gender-based violence and femicide, violence towards journalists and activists, the role of organized crime in elections and how those pose a risk to Mexico's democratic political system. But we also discuss, of course, illicitly manufactured fentanyl, illicit arms trafficking, as well as how to restore trust between security agencies in the United States and Mexico. And so those are some of the issues that we touch upon. There are others that are discussed in this chapter, but it's really an effort to sort of talk about issues that are going to be really important and to really bring back the conversation to concrete topics, right? Not just to kind of get rid of the politics and all of this rhetoric that's probably going to come out, and it's already coming out on both sides of the border, and really focus on how to strengthen US-Mexico bilateral cooperation on security issues, John.
Lila, when you got to that point where it's time to come up with the list of recommendations, did you take domestic politics into account? Did you think in terms of what might fly, or did you think in terms of these would be the ideal solutions and let's just throw them out there and start a discussion?
Yeah, by no means are the recommendations in the security chapter, and I would say for all chapters, an exhaustive list of recommendations for Mexico's future leader. But I think what they do is really hone in on issues that we believe, right, as experts, academics, and people that breathe every single day the U.S.-Mexico relationship and Mexico internally. For sure, we took into consideration domestic issues in Mexico, but I think also we based it on really hard data, right, and really good sources. And so the way that we present the recommendations and the information in the security chapter, and I would argue for others as well, is to be able to say these are a recommendation based on this data, right? So we're saying for, let's say, gender-based violence or for organized crime involved in elections, we look at sources that reveal that this is an issue internally for Mexicans that are very alert, that are very concerned about what that could mean for the June 2nd elections. To give you an example, yes, femicide and gender-based violence is a huge issue, not as talked about on the bilateral relationship, but we are talking about the first female president, right, or first potential female president of Mexico. And that doesn't necessarily mean that femicide and gender issues are going to be at the forefront of the agenda. But the reality is that since 2018, at least 10 women are killed every day because of their gender in Mexico. And this has to be one of the issues that's talked about when we talk about security. And so that's just one example of other issues where we took domestic and internal politics of Mexico and used it as a way to develop these recommendations. But again, a lot of this is based on sources and a lot of it is on hard data as it relates to fentanyl or arms trafficking and other issues in the security chapter, John.
Thank you. Andrew, you are involved in two chapters. You wrote the one on nearshoring and you co-authored the one on water. Give us a bit of a preview of what you talk about in those.
Sure. On nearshoring, to put it in simple terms, after both the Trump administration focus on applying tariffs on Chinese goods and due to the pandemic, there was really a shift as manufacturers started looking for alternative sites to manufacture to try to both create supply chain resilience and to reduce the length of supply chains. And Mexico has seen a lot of investment as a result, 35 billion last year and 29 billion through the first half of this year. And so the real question, sort of the premise of the chapter is, what does Mexico need to do to ensure that this level of investment continues and that it doesn't become just sort of a blip in time? And so what we do is identify 4 key areas, sort of reflecting on what Lila just said after lots of conversations and analysis and sort of a sense of what matters to the people doing the investing. And the 4 areas are workforce development, infrastructure, security, and energy. And in fact, the energy chapter, which our colleague Duncan Wood wrote, and the nearshoring chapter have a fair amount of overlap, because without access to clean, affordable, reliable energy, it's not going to be possible to capitalize on the wave of investment. And the same is true in the area of infrastructure, where there is both the need for infrastructure on the US-Mexico border, which really is about border facilitation and ensuring that products can easily cross the border, and also infrastructure development in the south of Mexico. One of the points that I think it's important to make is when we talk about nearshoring, people tend to think only US-Mexico border. And the reality is nearshoring can happen anywhere in Mexico. And in fact, if the next president is successful in encouraging that investment in other parts of the country, it will contribute to efforts to reduce inequality, create economic growth and development. So that's really kind of the focus of the nearshoring chapter. The water chapter started out, we thought we would look at cross-border water and realize that it was a much richer topic, but it really comes from the premise that water is likely to be the next big challenge for the US and for Mexico, both cross-border because we share water resources and in Mexico. And so the chapter talks about some of the stressors on Mexico's water supply, and Mexico's access to clean water, which include inadequate infrastructure, which hasn't been maintained, the growing trend in urbanization. As we all know, concrete buildings and parking lots and highways don't really absorb water, it just runs off. And then a little piece about the 1944 US-Mexico Water Treaty, which is the agreement that governs use of the Rio Grande and the Colorado River. And those are all issues that the next president will have to address. And we thought water is maybe one of those issues. We talked about doing things that are a little bit different, or there's a little bit less focus. I think people don't talk as much about the water challenge in Mexico and cross-border as they should. So we wanted to.
No, I mean, if you look at the table of contents, that's the one that jumps out, right? As the others are almost predictable. This is a bit of a surprise, but I'll give a plug to one of our fellow, our colleagues here at the Environmental Change and Security Program. You know, they've been on this for years in advance, that this is coming and will become an issue globally and regionally. And they were right. And here it is. And now you have a chapter on it.
They're absolutely right. If you look at the dry part of the United States is contiguous to the driest part of Mexico. And that is where, for example, Mexico's large lithium deposit is located. So if Mexico is going to exploit that deposit, how do you do that in an arid area? We don't go into this in the chapter, but I think looking ahead, those are the kinds of questions that Mexican leaders will have to debate and make decisions on.
Yeah. So I think we've made it clear already, but I just want to revisit this notion that this wasn't, you sitting in Washington, D.C. and looking south and making judgments across the border from a distance. There was a process here where you engaged within country and with experts from Mexico. And I'm wondering, when push came to shove and it was time to choose the topics and come up with recommendations, was there consensus among the group? Was it easy to reach consensus? I mean, are we talking about something where there may even be consensus among the electorate in Mexico that these are directions that make sense for the country?
Yeah, if I can sort of tackle this question first, Andrew. I think there is consensus, John, about sort of the main issues, right, in Mexico and how they concern the future of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. That said, there are some issues that are extremely important to Mexican citizens that are not necessarily addressed directly, or that a whole chapter is dedicated to them, such as, for example, health, democracy, right? Democracy, rule of law. I mean, they're somewhat discussed, right, in the security chapter. But one of the underlying concerns, right, as we approach the June 2nd elections in Mexico, is whether Mexico's democracy is gonna flourish, or if it's gonna, face some setbacks. And so I think that it's not only historical because of the number, more than 20,000 positions are up for election. The whole Congress, 9 governorships, the presidency. I mean, but how the elections are going to actually play out, right? If the results are going to be respected, if the National Electoral Institute is going to be able to thoroughly analyze and produce results, are they going to get accepted by the different candidates, by the different coalition groups? I think that is an essential aspect of what Mexican citizens are looking for, right, in these next elections. Election integrity, I think that's going to be extremely important. But that said, again, we couldn't include all of these issues, or we could, but our sense was that we would produce a short enough booklet to the next presidential candidates, who we hope will come to the Wilson Center in the upcoming months to talk about their political platforms, and deliver this book as a means to spark conversations with the different presidential candidates, and to get a sense of what their view and vision for the future of Mexico is in terms of these 6 issues, and also others that are not included in this booklet, John.
Well, it's at the risk of editorializing, Lila, I would say Mexico is not the only country that's going to be having a referendum on how it feels about its democracy and how it wants to move forward. I mean, this is many nations, including the one we're sitting in, are facing such questions. This is terrific stuff. I don't want to go through the entire book because I want to encourage people to read it for themselves. You've talked about the chapters you've written, but before we close, I want to give each of you a chance for some final thoughts, or if there's anything you want to point out to our viewers that maybe we haven't discussed that you think it's really important for them to hear. Andrew, let's start with you, and then we'll give Lila the final word.
Okay, sounds good, John. Well, you're right. We have covered a lot of ground. I think for the size of the book, it's actually pretty rich in terms of what we try to cover. As Lila just said, the goal really was to provoke conversation. I think very much in keeping with the spirit of the Wilson Center. It's okay if people don't agree with every recommendation. I think we'll be very anxious to hear what the candidates think of whether the diagnosis, because each chapter basically sets out, this is where we are now, or this is where we will be on October 1st, 2024, when the next president takes office. And this is what we think, based on all the research and conversations that we've had over the past year, this is what we think you ought to do. And I think it'll be really enriching to see whether candidates say, I like this idea, I don't like this idea, I'm going to do something different. The other point I'd make, and I mentioned this in the intro to the event this afternoon, is that it's probably not possible, both for political and financial reasons, for the next president to do everything in this book. And we did that not on purpose, but in the sense that we didn't make an effort to say, here's a bunch of recommendations, but do them in this order. It really, I think what it sets out is the challenges that the next president will face in trying to address all of these issues, which are very often interconnected, but and so fixing one will have knock-on or advantageous impacts on fixing others. But the reality is it's a pretty ambitious agenda, even to do these 6. And the truth is the next Mexican president will face many more than 6. So really, that was kind of the idea behind the book, was to spark this conversation, point out where the challenges are, and as we said, see where we can go in terms of helping to promote this conversation.
Well, mission accomplished and provoking discussion. And, we're an ideas factory, right, Andrew? We don't have to worry about budget priorities. That's someone else's job. Lila, you get
I would say 2 things, John. And the first one is that this book is not the end, right? This is not like where we stop our electoral cycle programming. We have not only longer policy papers that we hope will be published in the upcoming months on all of these issues, but really going into more detail on each of them and on issues that weren't included in this short booklet. That said, we also have a series of webinars that are going to be launched at the beginning of next year on all issues that are fundamental to Mexico's democracy, to Mexico's security, polling experts. I think it's going to be a really exciting time for the Mexico Institute ahead of the election. And I would just conclude with saying that, it's extremely important who wins the presidency in Mexico, and it's equally important who wins the presidency in the United States. I think we are so intertwined. It is the one bilateral relationship where issues are affecting daily lives, right, on both sides of the border. It affects the Mexican economy and the U.S. economy. Security issues involve both nations. So hopefully the next 2 leaders on both sides of the border will work together to really strengthen the North America region, to strengthen commercial ties, to work together to combat mutually interested, mutual challenges such as migration, climate change, and others. And so I think it's going to be a really great opportunity for the United States and Mexico to really show how important this bilateral relationship is for both countries.
Well, thanks, Lila, Abed, Andrew, Rudman. You're making a terrific contribution to these important elections, and this is great work. And all the stuff Lila was just talking about, if you come to wilsoncenter.org and click on the programs tab at the top of the screen and find the Mexico Institute, all of this great work from Lila, Andrew, and the terrific team they represent is available to you. And the good news is that the Wilson Center, all free of charge. We're not selling anything here. It's a public service. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thank you for your time and interest.